Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Dr. Tina Sikka. I am a reader in technoscience and intersectional justice in the School of Arts and Culture at Newcastle University.
Now, Prof. Sikka, it's early morning here, and I haven't had breakfast, so I need to ask you about the food part of your work. But before
Okay.
I ask you about the food part of your work, I'll ask you about lots of other things too.
Mhm.
In order to satisfy my banal, but to me quite important desires for an initial question. Can you share with us what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting, impeding you? What's going on for the prof?
Well, I'll base it on the thing I last read was an article in the New York Times, and this is completely outside the scope of my research, but it was really, I was
Hmm.
trying to make sense of it, and it is
Hmm.
the use of cryptocurrency in Venezuela.
Hmm.
As a form of trying to stabilize the economy. And it's an area where I feel so uninformed of how these kind of financial mechanisms that are used in different ways outside of the public purview are maintaining whole economies and how they sort of structure and function in international relations, particularly with the U.S. bringing, carriers and boats and bombing and everything near
Hmm.
Venezuela. And so it was that. It was the new kind of monetary technologies and how important it is to try and understand how they operate and work, um, and how very little the public really knows about it.
Yes, interesting point. Remittances have long been a very important means of providing, in inverted commas, an organic form of development, close inverted commas,
Mhm.
especially in a place like Mexico or Venezuela. And of course, cryptocurrency gives you a means of doing that that manages to avoid certain inflationary elements, supposedly.
Yeah.
One of the great artworks that I saw the other day here is of undocumented Mexicans working in the United States who dress up in superhero uniforms to do their work. So, guys doing working construction dressed as Spider-Man and various other things. Men and women of different ages. And then the caption describing what they do lists how much money they send in remittances weekly,
Mhm.
monthly, or annually back to Mexico. Enormously effective form of agitprop, I think. And of course, lots of people in the World Bank and other places love this stuff because they think it's
Yeah.
getting away from the governmental gears. In the case of Venezuela, it's, I think, to use the technical language of feminist theory, it's such a shit show. It's such a disaster, uh,
Yeah.
as is the United States. I'm biased against cryptocurrency because Trump is making so much money out of it.
I
So,
am as well. It's one of those things where it's like a technology where like the infrastructure is such that it has the potential to be used in subversive ways. And when I see it being done so, that's great, but it gets co-opted as all things do by neoliberal capitalism and everything else.
oh,
Yeah.
and by crooks. So, Prof, if I look
Yeah.
out on the skyline here, there are probably a dozen skyscrapers in construction. They're all built with narco money, a lot of
Hmm.
it cyber money. They're not designed ever to be occupied, other than by other narcos, if ever to be completed. They're means of laundering money and avoiding taxes.
Yeah.
And the crypto world is crucial for these people.
Hmm.
And this town is completely dominated by narco terrorism, really.
Hmm.
So that side of it, rather than those romantic, anarchistic notions from a decade ago, plus, as you say, the capture by
Yeah.
corporate sources, really mean that I'll have none of it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm on the same page, but it was just, one of those things where you start looking through and like what are the things that I should know something more
But
about, but I
I don't
don't.
yet.
Yeah.
Well, On that score, Prof, you mentioned or you implied technoscience. Before we get on to my current obsession with you, which is food, because I'm
Mhm.
so hungry, could you tell us about your amazing work on technoscience, technoengineering,
Mhm.
geoengineering, which you've addressed from political economic, feminist, decolonial perspectives, inter alia?
Yeah.
I know that's a big question because you've done so
Yeah.
much, but there's a moment in one of your food pieces where you
Mhm.
say, I just finished my book on these issues when along came the opportunity to talk about food, and it was nice to relax a little bit whilst also being seriously engaged. So take us back, back, back. I think that book came out maybe 2023.
Yes.
So it's quite young. It's a toddler.
Mhm.
Tell us
Yeah.
about the toddler, Prof.
Yeah. Well, with the geoengineering, that was sort of my first area post PhD, where I proposed my postdoc, and I was looking at kind of critical science studies and looking at climate change, and I kind of got hooked on geoengineering and climate engineering, and really trying to figure out what was happening in that area, how these kind of science fiction-y forms of climate mitigation were being brought into the public sphere and potential for tests. And I started to look at some of the science and the studies, and and again, like just like we were talking about with crypto, there's a lot of kind of neoliberal tech bro backing of climate engineering. And I found that really interesting as well, that kind of like shortcut to mitigate climate change by throwing up sulfates in the atmosphere to reflect sunlight and all of that. And I thought it was, in terms of technoscience and feminist science, of looking at the values and the norms and the impact of scientific practice on marginalized groups in particular. And so I started looking at, okay, what is mapping the political economy of climate engineering, looking at how it would affect marginalized groups. So, it's
Mm.
not enough just to say that it's going to increase monsoons, and that is going to be true. But also thinking about, okay, what does that mean for the, woman in Bangladesh who is going to be impacted by these technologies? And so really focusing on the granular, examination of the technologies. And then I took that kind of framework and moved over to food and health,
Mm.
to think about, these technologies like apps and the technologies of diet, the governmentality and the biopolitics of both,
Mm.
to look at how the social construction of good health is mediated by technologies, and how those technologies shape our understandings of our bodies, and using a feminist lens in that context, but also creating very kind of hegemonic understandings of gender norms and of racial stereotypes, and of really thinking about how science works to produce in a like not non-objective way, but in a way that shapes human behavior and shapes understandings of health and citizenship and what it means to be a good person even. And so I kind of did that for quite a while, and was looking at, the ecosystem of health apps and bioscience and genetic testing. And yeah.
So the two books we're talking about, or the Prof is talking about, the 2019 one is Climate Technology, Gender and Justice, The Standpoint of the Vulnerable. A great subtitle, by the way, I think. And the 2023 one that I referred to, but you were just discussing health apps, genetic diets, and superfoods when biopolitics meets neoliberalism. So it seems to me, and I haven't got copies of the books. I've read a lot of your articles, but you're super prolific, so that doesn't make me in any sense well read about your work. But what I think I can tell from the material I've read is that you're
Yeah.
seeking a form of rapprochement between Foucauldian ideas, you mentioned biopolitics and governmentality, the old man, Carlito Marx,
Mhm.
and feminist and decolonial approaches.
Yeah.
Is that a happy marriage? I mean, no marriages are happy, but
Yeah. Yeah. It is difficult because I think about, the intersection of intersectionality and Marxism, and there's often this kind of, identity politics versus material conditions debate that takes over. And I think a lot of my work is really trying to say that that's not the case. That's not how feminist work and intersectional scholarship works, that it is firmly embedded in material conditions. Yeah.
no, point taken. I don't know if you saw the podcast
Yep.
hearing,
Yep. I love it.
he made one of his interventions. This could mean, Prof, oh no, he's coming back around. He was lurking behind the laptop, which can mean he tries to close the lid,
Mm,
and can also mean that if I'm typing at all and he can see my fingers at the edges of the keyboard, a claw will come out and
yeah.
just leave a little mark to remind me that someone's more important than whatever else it is I'm
Yeah.
doing or whoever else I'm talking to. Anyway, Prof, no, I take your point. In a way, this goes back to those debates, I mean, really in the New Left
Yeah.
about leftism and feminism in those days, but also civil rights, that in some ways really were false debates, I think, but necessary debates from feminist perspectives. What about the question of Foucault and Marxism, where
Mhm.
again, lots of people argue for a neoliberal uptake of Foucault and claim that he's an unremitting critic of Marxism? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I read that piece that came out, I think maybe a year and a half ago or something, that was like a complete rereading of Foucault as a neoliberal, and the kind of, formulations around care that he has in later work, in particular, of that idea of the technologies of the self. And I don't agree with that particular reading. I think that there is an an argument to be made that, particularly when it relates to health and technologies of the self, it's not necessarily that he states that kind of supports that reading. He's sort of giving an overview of what he sees happening. And so, arguing about it, I don't necessarily see that he endorses that idea, but he's talking about technologies of the self. And in some ways, sometimes you read and you're like, okay, well, maybe he's like veering into the kind of neoliberal, take care of yourself and, how to cultivate yourself. And that reads a little bit neoliberal, but I think his early work on biopolitics and kind of health regimes and technologies of, that intersect with neoliberalism, but are really about how difficult and how dangerous that kind of governmentality is, which is what I kind of, like to bring out in my work a little bit more. And then I'm really am committed to the materialist analysis of the political economy, the relations of power, the how capitalism, just sort of evolves and grows in this very pernicious way, and it creates understandings of health and wellness that operate for its reproduction. And so that is really important to me as well. And then you also have the intersectionality and the experiences of marginalized groups. And I'm always trying to, see how to kind of navigate and bring those into some kind of equilibrium. Um, and what I've been using quite a bit recently are new iterations from Black feminism around new materialism, which I find, quite useful because it has that kind of Marxist edge to it, that materialist edge to it. But then also talks about decolonialism and marginalization and relations of power.
Yes, absolutely. I quite agree with you. I don't think there are any necessary impossibilities here or incommensurabilities. I think that those things fit naturally together. I really do. And it's a misreading of so much of, for example, the civil rights movement in the United States, as understood in this case to include African Americans, to include feminists, to include queer people, etc., right? To say that these did not have material analyses of exploitation and inequality is absurd. So, now can I ask more about food, please, Prof?
Mhm. Mhm.
So, what's the jag? What's the thing about food that for you is crucial?
Mhm. I think it is that it is a form of culture and belonging. It's a kind of identity. It has economic impacts in terms of, the food industry and the production and, the supply chains. And it is a source of a lot of anxiety
Mm,
as well. I think connecting it to things like how consumption of food is connected to how we sort of look in terms of our bodies, and then how that is judged in terms of whether we are healthy or not, or whether we are, good citizens of society, but in terms of what we eat, how we eat. There's so many ethical quandaries around it if we're talking about veganism or anything else. So I just think it's one of those sites of just so much conversation that you can kind of dive into and just, take any kind of theoretical framework and say, okay, like how would this, examine food and food culture? And now how it's increasingly being, technologized and, you know, monetized and appified in the last few years as well.
so it's been amplified by being amplified. Uh,
Yeah.
One co-authored article, a bravura piece I thought really fascinating, you produced on this is in part about fatness
Mhm.
and COVID-19.
Yeah.
And this is a series of interviews you've done with people who were patients in the National Health Service in Britain, I think,
Mhm.
during the first two deadliest waves of the pandemic. And some of the forms of subjectification that
Mhm.
they were categorized via. Could you tell us a wee bit about that research?
Yeah, that was research that I did. Actually, I co-wrote it with two of my PhD students. I really tried particularly over the pandemic, trying to co-author pieces with my graduate students as a way. It's just so disheartening sometimes to see the job market and the expectations and just trying to do what I can to place them in the best position to get something afterwards. And so we did these. It was research that kind of overlapped in my interests and their interests. And so we did a number of interviews with patients who identified.
I paused it because you froze there for a second, Prof.
Oh, oh, okay.
Not emotionally, intellectually, linguistically, but technologically. So
Okay,
you were just before the big freeze of 2025,
okay.
you were saying that you had grad students as co-authors and you're frustrated by the way the job market.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I was really trying at that time to do what I can to to have them be placed in a better position when they start going looking for, academic jobs, which a lot of them still want to do, but there's not a lot of opportunity anymore. And so we did the series of interviews with patients who identified as fat and otherwise marginalized in other ways. And their experience of getting care for long COVID during the lockdown. And it was quite disheartening. And there were a lot of tears and there was a lot of anger on their part, but we looked to see what the theoretical frameworks that were out there that could help us kind of understand what was happening, and to work with the patients and the people that we interviewed to get some of their voices out there. So, and their experiences of feeling both invisible and hyper visible was like one key thing, that, was quite um, useful in helping us understand what was going on. And then also things like the infrastructure and the spatial dimensions of a examination room and things like the chairs and, not being able to fit and not having the right cuffs for blood pressure and then not being believed as well or being told to lose weight when it was a totally not unrelated ailment or issue. And then how that intersected with gender, and also of sexuality with some patients who presented as non-binary, felt that they weren't being taken seriously.
There is this bad mix of misogyny, aesthetics, and health that really merges around so-called obesity.
Mhm.
And quite obviously, for perhaps the majority of women, certainly in the global north, body image is a huge problem. And it's increasingly a problem for young men. I mean, the plastic surgery figures obviously see women well ahead of men, but men are shooting up the chart,
Yeah.
particularly young men with different issues. I wonder, does this relate to some of the work you've done on neoliberalism and in a sense, the politics of the self, that you must be in charge of everything about you?
Yeah. Yeah, and that idea of like the cultivation of the self, of self-presentation. And I mean it comes down to again the material conditions. I mean there are very real um statistics around, if you are normatively thin, you tend to have higher pay. You tend to have higher education. You tend to be able to access care more easily. And so there is a kind of, nexus around body size in particular that can have real material impact. And then you have on top of that the argument that the way that we think about fatness and obesity is very much a cultural thing, and we often veil it in I'm just worried about your health, and that's not really, there's not a correspondence or a one-to-one between how someone looks and their health status. I mean, I've had it before where you're sick for 2 weeks and you lose 5 pounds and someone's like, oh, you look great, and you're like, I've just been in the bathroom throwing up for the past 2 weeks. This is, this something's wrong here. And that, you've got problems with the BMI as a way to um, kind of say whether someone's healthy or not. So there's all of those things going on. And I find it really, really interesting in how we have such rigid norms and expectations around masculinity and femininity and bodies and food, in ways that are kind of glossed over by this idea of health. And then we are also, on top of that, the kind of self-image issue, we have real material benefit from fitting into that size that is seen as acceptable. And that comes from even income or access to goods and services and feeling comfortable in public. I think all of that is going on at the same time, and it is amplified by neoliberal capitalism, which is benefiting off of driving that, further.
I really liked your article. I think it's called Food and Femininity, in
Mm.
which you draw on Pierre Bourdieu's work, but really to talk about the division of labor in the preparation of food. And I wanted to ask you about that in terms of the attempt to emphasize the responsibility of women to keep the family healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, that labor that goes into maintenance and reproduction of the family has been something that we said, okay, in the past, there was just this recognition of the reproduction of the family as being the women's role, but now there are so many expectations aligned to it. And I started to think about that more and more when I read, I can't remember what book it was, but it was from like the 80s. And they were talking about how the introduction of washing machines didn't actually decrease the amount of labor that women were doing in terms of washing clothes because it just increased the expectations around how many times you needed to do it and how
Oh,
clean
which
your children
reminds me, I've got
had
to put a load on. Sorry, keep going.
to be. Yeah, and so it's that idea that there's this hyperfixation on how women are doing that reproductive labor in the home and judgment on their children and what they're feeding them and whether what their children look like as well. And I think that that is a kind of capital that can be accrued and used in different ways, but it is a form of labor that is increasing. And I see this looking at social media, looking at, videos on things like trad wives and, women starting to, make their own toothpaste and do all these kinds of things, which, it's like my kids wanted cornflakes or, and I'm going to make them. And they go out and like pick corn. And you're like, what is happening
No,
here?
this is forget care of the self. You've got to care for every other bastard
Yeah,
first, right?
yeah.
I mean, I'm very conscious of the kind of public health campaigns that proliferate in the United States that focus on women as being responsible for making sure that family members, be it including themselves, have good amounts of fruit and vegetable in their diet. And all of this is normally done with a person who looks like she's mid-30s, is beautiful in conventional terms, all the rest of it, and is clearly middle class. And there's no acknowledgement that one reason why poor people in the United States often eat poorly, in inverted commas, is that they can't afford fresh food. They
Mhm.
can't afford it in terms of the time and the labor required to go and buy it and to prepare it, to make your own cornflakes, to use your wonderful example, right? That this is just, sorry, I've almost finished putting on the load. I've just poured the Ariel Concentrado color, because blue is good.
Mhm.
Blue means the clothes will become clean, or as they used to say, whiter than white. Um, that there is no recognition that it may be economically, literally impossible to feed your children and yourselves healthily if you live and work in certain parts of certain cities. Do you know what I mean? There's just
Yeah.
an absolute misrecognition of material circumstance. Um,
Yeah, and I think that it is a kind of food apartheid. And I know that the term that's often used is food desert, but I think that it's that a food apartheid is more apt because it is an actual outcome of policy that the inaccessibility is made concrete. And you have food that isn't particularly nourishing subsidized, which is why it's cheaper to buy something that is high in calories and might be, cheap, but is not very nourishing versus something that is. But then there is also this idea that the judgment that often goes around food choice tends to be quite racialized, which I find interesting as well in terms of the judgment about ethnic food in particular. And I see that quite a bit in the UK around the South Asian community and type 2 diabetes, where it's, sort of said that, it's the food that they eat. And they do these studies on like restaurant food and the calories in Indian restaurant food. And I'm like, are you assuming that they're going out every day and that's all they eat? I mean that idea of like that there is some kind of correlation there. I think maybe people go out maybe once or twice. What about stress? What about marginalization? What about all these other things that impact whether someone gets type 2 diabetes or not? Maybe it is, the marginalization and oppression of racialized groups and that the impact of that on health, which is what should be addressed, not saying don't go to Indian restaurants.
What about all those footballers and their fans who go to the pub, drink vast amounts of beer, and then go to a South Asian restaurant to mop things up?
Mhm.
Interesting issue here. When I, God help me, or Marx, de Beauvoir, Angela helped me, I moved back to Britain in 2012, around the time of the grotesque Summer Olympics, when Bhopal was very much a topic of discussion, and there were
Mm,
great protests that had been mounted for years by survivors and their families. There was a big vote taken, I think, by the BBC. What is British national food? And I assumed it would be, you know, maybe bangers and mash, but probably fish and chips. It was, in inverted commas, curry
yeah,
by far.
yeah,
And so there is this simultaneous desire to own and to other South Asian food in British discourses of
yeah.
these
It
things.
was quite it was quite funny too. There were videos that were going around with participants in the far right protests a few weeks ago in London, um, lining up for kebabs afterwards.
I
It
shouldn't,
was
I shouldn't
like,
laugh. I'm sorry, but so
but
but
it was funny. It was like, how are you kind of reconciling
this is
this? Like,
300,000, I presume almost only white people
yeah,
marching and protesting per the old days of the left against otherness, basically.
yeah,
Is that fair to say? Yeah. And they were lining up for
yeah, yeah.
other food.
Yeah, and I will say though, just to go back to the issue of like the way science is kind of manipulated in a way to serve, more kind of capitalist profit making. That one of the things I do often say that, people will say, what do you say for people who lose weight? Like, do you judge them? Do you say like you shouldn't? But I just think that the forces and the pressure are so much aligned against someone taking a stand and being like, I'm going to be comfortable in the body that I'm in. And it's about body diversity. We don't make these assumptions when people are tall or, and that so much of your size is determined by your genes, that I can't and would never judge someone from engaging in, diets, even though 95% of the time they don't work, or even taking GLP-1s, which is the big thing now, and the controversy around what that is going to do in terms of how we treat different bodies in public and how we judge them.
And I
And
think
class,
if
yeah.
you're on HIV retrovirals, I think you can't take it, actually.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I learned recently. So, oh my God, the cats are in the first phase of love fighting. I've never had two cats at once. So this starts with licking one another in a really
Mhm.
kind and gentle way and then turns into a battle.
Oh,
So right now she's pursuing him across the room. He's looking frightened. Anyway, but no, it is very interesting as to what happens with that. I think about this in the context of Lionel Messi, the
mhm.
Argentine footballer, who, as you know, is very short, but genetically was going to be even shorter, but was given monumental amounts of growth hormones when he was moved to Barcelona in his prepubescent times. And so
Mhm.
he's not a tall guy now, but he's a lot taller than he could have been, would have been.
Yeah.
What on earth happens to his body when he's 50 or 60? No one knows.
Yeah.
So there is this, of course, there are clinical trials, but what do they mean in terms of the next generation, the generation after that, and all the rest of it? And also, what is the relationship between genuine public health issues and aesthetics and
Yeah.
design? and desire.
Mhm. Oh yeah, I think that that is, in terms of the capital that aesthetics accrues to people who are conventionally attractive in kind of the market of dating and everything else is very
Mhm.
much connected to this as well. And if we think about it sort of very crudely, the in terms of status and being desired, the power of a very particular kind of aesthetic has in determining whether, you get married or you have children, and that is all wrapped up in media representation and capitalism and public health policy, and everything else.
And Prof, mentioning sex desire brings me on to a third of your books, which I again don't have access to, but I've read a couple of articles of yours that are adjacent,
Mhm.
one in the popular media, one a research article. And this is Sex, Consent, and Justice, a new feminist framework. This is where if I want to kiss someone, I say, may I kiss you?
Mhm.
Thereby destroying flirtation, passion, or thereby enabling a serious discussion of consent.
Yeah. Yeah, that work was really interesting in terms of the theoretical framework that I was using to look at how consent historically kind of emerged and became quite hegemonic, and how it has very clear shortcomings in terms of thinking about how we enter into relationships, how consent, as a kind of framework has real problems with it, just in terms of how we think about how sexual interactions actually happen in practice. It often doesn't involve a like, can I, yes, no kind of relationship. That pleasure is kind of delimited. It has a sort of impoverished understanding of pleasure here. That, that it is this idea of women being the ones who give consent, which kind of replicates that idea of women as not having desire, that they're kind of the gatekeeper, which again, that's like a quite, problematic construction. And how it doesn't really contend with inequalities of power, how it's very heteronormative. And so I have all these kinds of, critiques, and I posit a different understanding of consent. And the model is a pleasure and care-centered ethic of embodied and relational otherness. And I sort of, through my examination and literature review and all of that, and my examination, Me Too in particular, I go through and pull out some principles that I think might be applicable for a more capacious understanding of sex and sexual interaction.
Can you spill the beans on that, or do people have to buy
Yeah.
the book?
No, no. I absolutely. I like the first one is thinking about how all sexual acts are formed out of assemblages, so that it's not just a yes and no in isolation, that there are norms and technologies and intensities, they're value laden. I kind of center pleasure and mutual pleasure. That danger is part of this as well, and that kind of care for the self and other, but also leaving room for transactional sex and sex work, and everyday sex. That it needs to be queer, and push queer boundaries. That is being, really significant. An ethic of communication, but one that is a little bit more open to interpretation. Orientation to the other, that you're co-constituting a sexual act with. Um, and then the last one is that it is embodied and relational and co-determinative. So it needs to account for unequal power relations, as well. And
So,
so those are, yeah, go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
No, those are the kind of six principles,
Right.
ones that are generative, and to think about sexual ethics differently.
And sounds like you're bringing big bad boy Bruno into that. When you say assemblages, that's a Latour keyword. So some of these great men are definitely hovering around your work, aren't they? And they
Yeah.
hover around mine, I should say. So
Yeah, Karen Barad and Bruno Latour and the kind of feminist approaches that are pulling from Deleuze and Guattari as well.
right.
And I like even when it comes to intersectionality, some of the critiques that Jennifer Nash and Jasbir Puar have made around intersectionality and they're sort of friendly critiques, but thinking about assemblages as a better way of thinking about interaction and identity is, something that I really, really quite like.
Now, Prof, the things that I read of yours on related topics were twofold. So one is a magazine piece, really interesting, with a picture of a rogues gallery of bad men. I think you call them bad men,
Mhm.
most of whom I must admit I couldn't recognize. But I did notice Harvey W. And
Yep.
you've got a let me just pull it up, wonderfully provocative title. Post Me To, Can We Still Consume the Work of, and you put it in inverted commas, bad men? Can you take us through that one if you can remember it? It's a
Yeah.
while back, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking about that quite recently, since the death of Diane Keaton, because
Oh,
looking
Woody
back at,
Allen. Yeah.
yeah, and thinking about how Diane Keaton sort of, still supported Woody Allen,
Right.
later in her life also. Yeah, that was one of the things because I do love some of the work that these artists have produced, and I'm kind of trying to navigate through, can you consume it? Should you consume it? And how you make that decision, and to think about how art is produced as well. So one of the things I always think about is that, this idea of like the great man theory of the artist as an individual actor that is producing, wonderful art in, a room secluded from everyone is not how art and culture gets produced. And so I was really thinking about that at the time with Bill Cosby, and I loved the Cosby Show when I was younger. Um, and like, how are you supposed to watch that? And
Yeah.
I, on the one hand, I was like, okay, if it's taken off the air, and what about all the other actors that are not getting royalties from this? And like, what about, the people who worked so hard to produce this? And so on a kind of theoretical level, you can say, well, if the person is not profiting off of my viewing it, perhaps I can justify it. But then when you sit down and watch the Cosby Show, because he's such a big part of it, you're kind of like, oh, like you just can't do it anymore. So how that kind of affective um, response can shape how you decide what you consume. And so I wanted to do a little bit of a like how art is produced and how you decide, and when it is really visceral, a reaction that you can't do it anymore. And how we also sort of perform virtue by what we consume and what we don't consume, and judge others for consuming it or not consuming it. I always think about it also in terms of like, do you play Michael Jackson at a party? Or do you play R. Kelly at a party? And that being a thing that is quite interesting in how people navigate these allegations and some of these really terrible behaviors.
The other piece that I guess articulates to the book that I read is about one of the real prohibitions in university life, and increasingly so, relations between generally female grad students and male professors, though not necessarily. And you quote these libertarian sisters, Lisa Dugan and Laura Kipnis. Laura, in particular, has run into something akin to loathing
Yeah.
for some of what she's had to say on this. Can you take us through the issues involved and what your take is?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm as part of my role, I'm also EDI director in the School of Arts and Culture, and there were a few instances where, and there were also at the same time like reports of relationships between graduate students and their supervisors. And then there were some rules that were going to go around and be enacted throughout higher ed in the UK to ban it. And there was a conversation that was happening, and I actually know some people who have married their supervisors or professors in the faculties that they were part of. And I wanted to write something on how we negotiate the very real statement from mostly women who say that, no, this was a freely chosen thing. I'm happy, and how dare you judge this, versus the university's responsibility to ensure that unequal power relations don't harm students. And so it was me trying to go through and navigate that. And I kind of came out in terms of my conclusion of there has to be a sense of expectation, transparency, procedure, but banning it is not, if your concern is unequal power relations and misogyny, attack that. Doing this like piecemeal stuff about banning things is not going to really address the issues you're concerned about. You want to create a environment where unequal power relations are delimited, that people have support, that your complaint processes are transparent and supportive, and to have expectations around what a supervisor's responsibilities are, and to not infantilize women, at the same time, but then to look, to kind of pull out a little bit and think about, what are the forces that might make such a relationship problematic, when it relates to what if something goes wrong, like what if there is, a lot of impetus to take revenge on each other, that there's, the impact on other students. So there's all of that as well. So it's, yeah, and that piece I was just trying to navigate and think about how to examine what is a really polarizing conversation with a little less sort of anger that I was
Mm.
seeing.
And Kipnis obviously is somebody who cites her own romantic escapades with profs in pleasurable forms and says, I was an adult, go away.
Yeah, yeah.
And okay, thanks a lot. So we've done food, we've done sex, but I want to get back to the technoscience stuff if we
Mhm.
could to finish up, Prof. And what I want to do is I've got one last question for you. And then after that, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you may wish. And that could be going back over terrain we've traversed, where you want to amplify your remarks, or it might be something entirely new that I've missed out, because as I said, you're such a prolific and distinguished author. So, on to my last question, and it's about this issue of climate engineering, geoengineering, which you mentioned earlier in the context of tech bros. But something's got to be done.
Yeah.
Yes or no?
Yeah, I completely, I mean, for climate engineering, it's different for different kinds of schemes. The thing with the sulfates in the air, solar radiation management, is that if you start it, you can't stop. And if you do stop, the temperature is going to go up really high. There's so many unseen kind of consequences. There's questions around countries going rogue and doing it. Like, how do we do that? Who decides? Who doesn't decide? We can't decide on anything globally. So, like, how would this sort of work in practice? I mean, the argument is often that it might buy time. A lot of proponents of climate engineering are not arguing that it should be a replacement for mitigation strategies. They often argue that it is a, a, an attempt to buy time so that we can do the things that we need to do. And there are other actions like putting, mirrors in space and, seeding the ocean with, things that will pull out carbon and sink to the bottom of the ocean and all these other things. But I think in a larger sense, it is about, what are we putting our scientific resources to? Is this just a way for us to consume with abandon and not make the very difficult changes that we need to do? Um, it is about, the decision makers that are going to decide whether or not we do this and for how long and with what resources and where are going to be representative of people from, the Western countries, mostly men, mostly white men, mostly cis white men, and the decisions that they've made are not always in the interest of the entire world. And so I think the thing that I'm often thinking about is what are the principles that shape scientific practice and what we put our resources to? How can we change those so that climate engineering wouldn't seem like the, obvious option? That there are other things that we could possibly do. And there are also senses that, even with alternative energy, it's not necessarily that the technologies to help us do this don't exist, but it is that there's no incentive to do it, in terms of the harms that are going to come to people in power. They can, run to New Zealand and their, bunkers there, whereas everyone else is going to have to deal with the fallout.
Yes, but I'm also worried about Modi and Xi Jinping deciding to do this, I have to say.
Mhm.
Um,
Absolutely. And I was also reading just this morning about Modi seeding clouds to increase rain, which is it's a kind of scientific practice that, doesn't have the greatest evidence, but it is this idea of, what would be the impact if you could manipulate weather in these kinds of ways. And I've softened on it a little bit. I think my arguments tend to be more about the science that is used to justify it, to think about how feminist science studies can impact how we practice science and the kind of ways in which we think about what questions to ask, what methods to use, in order to come up with conclusions that uh, are more representative of people, particularly people in marginalized parts of the world.
yes, I mean, back in the early 60s, JFK and the Soviets, as part of or alongside the space race, also had the weather control race.
Yep.
So, Prof, to finish up, as I said earlier, I'd like to invite you to add anything. Could be new material, could be something we already
Mhm.
covered.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm really excited about and working on is a grant proposal with some academics in the UK and Brazil. And it's sort of on the focus of health and science. And it is looking at moves um, to take diagnosis and diagnostic information around metabolic conditions like diabetes, hypertension, so-called obesity as well, and to feed all of that diagnostic information into large language models and AI to kind of, to make it that those technologies would be looking at someone's risk for these conditions. And so it is a kind of critique of AI. And, the problem is that if the information that's being fed is racialized and it is information that is problematic, and will it just reify, that kind of inequality in healthcare? One of the things that's really interesting is that in the UK, race is corrected on a lot of these equations. So, for example, if I went in and they were going to assess me for my risk of getting type 2 diabetes, they would add a coefficient because I'm South Asian to the actual marker, and so then it would go in. And so there's this aspect of race correction as being a holdover from like slavery and this idea that some bodies are better than other bodies genetically, and that we can separate them by race, where race is entire fiction. And so it's this idea that all of that biased information is going to be fed into these large language models, and it's going to be perpetuated by the AI, and particularly the idea of race as biological. And then comparing it to Brazil, because in Brazil they have very different understanding of race, and they don't use race correction because they have that idea of like racial democracy. And so it's this kind of comparison of, okay, there are racial inequalities in the healthcare system, but how can we kind of think about AI and diagnosis and inequality and marginalization to guide how we actually use this AI, these large language models, because it's quite unregulated. And yeah, we're just kind of working on putting together a proposal for that.
That's very exciting. Well, Prof. Tina, I want to thank you so much for your amazing contributions to so many spheres of knowledge, both in terms of their breadth and their depth, and for being so generous with your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you.